Turbo from Poznan, Poland, was formed in early 1980 by bassist Henryk Tomczak. He'd be joined by guitarist Wojciech Hoffman, drummer Wojciech Anoya, and vocalist Wojciech Savula to record a handful of tracks in June of the same year. Two of those tracks would be released by Ton Press Records as a single with a very straightforward pop rock sound. After this recording, the singer would be replaced by another vocalist, Piotr Krystik, who also recorded some fairly bland, poppy hard rock material with the band, most of which was never officially released, but received a lot of radio airplay around Poland. Henryk would leave Turbo around 1981 and be replaced by 16-year-old bassist Piotr Przybylski. They'd also bring on second guitarist Andrzej Wissow, as well as a new vocalist, Grzegorz Kupczyk, who I'm going to just call Greg. Based on their growing popularity in Poland, this lineup would get picked up by Polton Records to record their first full-length album in 1983, Grown Up Children, this time with much more of a heavy metal sound. The cover is a bit silly. I mean, those yellow overalls are a choice, but musically, I really like this whole album. There's a nice variety on this album, but a lot of it has a very early, traditional metal feel that reminds me a lot of Iron Maiden's first two albums. There was a lot going on in Poland politically, and the country was actually under martial law at the time, which likely contributed to the undercurrent of controlled aggression in the music here. But it's all balanced out perfectly with some insanely catchy melodies. But there are also some speedier vibes here as well, like on Days Past, with some excellent double bass drumming. And the fantastic bass is very present on this album, giving the already heavy music even more weight. And we get some amazing melodic guitar playing from Wojciech and Andrzej, from the speedy riffs and solos to the slower entries like an excellent instrumental. as well as a couple of ballads which both got promotional videos. They're pretty basic, with the band playing in a small room somewhere with randomly hung curtains and terrible lighting. I like this track, although it is admittedly a bit simple, but it would actually be the album's title track that would become Turbo's biggest hit.
Nauczyli nas regułek i dat, wbijali nam mądrości do łba, powtarzali, co nam wolno, co nie, przekonali, co jest dobre, co złe.
It looks to be the same boring room as the other video, but this one is definitely a better song, with an emotional chorus. It's not super heavy, obviously, but still a fantastic track on an overall great but somewhat restrained first album. However, due to the massive popularity of their debut, Turbo got the opportunity to release another video for a track not appearing on Grown Up Children. Although it's not quite a ballad, it's still on the slower side with kind of a groovy 70s feel. But overall, it's still a pretty solid track. They'd have another drummer on at this point, Richard Oleksy, who appears only in this video, along with Wojciech wearing those damn yellow overalls again, and Greg looking like a literature professor who's a little ticked off that you didn't turn your research paper in on time. Even with a major hit album out, Turbo was still trying to figure out their sound and their lineup. They'd eventually bring on drummer Alan Soares and bassist Bogusz Rutkiewicz to record their second album, Taste of Silence. Released in 1985 on this label, Turbo's second album in many ways continues along the same lines as the first, with mostly new wave of British heavy metal styled tracks, although it never seems to fully embrace it either. The guitar work here is still pretty nice, but it also incorporates a lot more of those laid-back 70s overtones as well. style is still a bit of a mix. Turbo's new look definitely reflects their Iron Maiden and Judas Priest influences, with way more spandex and leather. There are other styles experimented with here and there, and some of it fits pretty nicely, particularly in the solos. But overall, Taste of Silence takes on a more mid-tempo pace even on the faster tracks, and contains a handful of decent but fairly uneventful slower tracks. Perhaps the best example of this musical confusion is the track They Always Teach Us, which sounds like this on the album. It's one of the better tracks on the album for me, along with another kinda different, groovy solo. The music video version, though, for some reason, is much slower. Although, anytime a band is in a classroom in a music video, I'm all for it. Back in the classroom, the band moves on to science lessons, where they mix up chemicals and crush some Christmas ornaments in a bowl. Also, unfortunately, the solo is way more generic in the video too. I much prefer the album version, and we also never find out if Turbo passed their classes, but it's still nice to see something a little different in the video. While I do like this album, I ultimately have to put it more towards the just okay category overall. That said, it's still worth a listen for stuff like the instrumental closer, Birth of the Demon. It's a powerful, doomy track that feels somewhat at odds with the rest of Taste of Silence, but Birth of the Demon hints at the drastic change in style that was to come on Turbo's following album. For Taste of Silence, the label had apparently urged Turbo to write somewhat softer, radio-friendly material. After that flopped, Turbo would rectify this by moving over to Pronet Records for their third album, Satan's Cavalry. And it's a freaking great change to a thrashy focus with melodic touches and power metal solos. Greg had touched on some screamy vocals previously, but he takes them up a couple notches here and fits perfectly with the thrashy riffs. This whole album is awesome, and it definitely feels like Turbo were able to more openly explore an aggressive style here. But of course, Turbo still always managed to work in some really nice melodic bits, and the guitar playing here has a lot more energy and enthusiasm than on Taste of Silence.
Trudno powiedzieć, jaka będzie ta przyszłość rocka. Ja myślę, że muzyka się chyba rozwinie w kierunku bardzo agresywnego rocka. Tej odmiany speed metal, death metal, jak to niektórzy określają. Jest to po prostu muzyka bez oszustwa.
Co to znaczy bez oszustwa?
To znaczy wchodzi się na scenę, bierze się kabelek, wpina się do wzmacniacza, robi się głośno, uderza się w struny i się gra po prostu. Bez żadnych klawiszy, bez żadnej właściwie elektroniki. Jest to muzyka, która właściwie wypływa z naszego organizmu, z naszego wnętrza.
The balance of thrash and power metal, and even a little doom, is excellent, with the power metal taking over at times, like on one of my favorites off the album, Halley's Comet. It's a great mix of heavy and powerful, balanced out with some soaring guitar leads. In fact, we get a lot more Iron Maiden influences on Satan's Cavalry, but they're more Dickinson era here, of course, and far more effective, like in the epic instrumental closer, Galactic Gates. However, with the financial difficulties still affecting Poland at the time, Turbo were unable to create a stage show that they felt matched the epic music.
Byśmy chcieli przedstawić swoją muzykę w sposób teatralny wręcz. Cały spektakl do tekstów, które w tej chwili wykonujemy. No ale w tej chwili nie jesteśmy jeszcze w stanie tego zrealizować i przygotowujemy się właśnie do takiego spektaklu.
To są miliony po prostu, żeby kupić aparaturę, która nagłośniłaby tą salę, czy chociażby aparaturę dla nas. Są to grube miliony, których nie mamy i nigdy nie będziemy mieć po prostu. Także na pewno będziemy skazani na pracę w takich warunkach.
I should also point out that while Alan Soares played drums on the album, by the time it was released a year later, he'd been replaced by Thomas Guess. With his heavy-hitting style, Thomas would go on to appear on the most Turbo albums as a drummer, starting with The Last Warrior in 1987. I love this album, even more than Satan's Cavalry. It leans way harder into thrash, but it's also wildly creative, with seemingly endless badass riffs and elaborate guitar passages filling every track. But the following year, Turbo would re-record an English version of Last Warrior released by Noise Records, and that's mainly the one I'll be looking at. The English version includes one additional track and swaps the order of two others, but otherwise I didn't notice any major differences. Like Satan's Cavalry, Last Warrior still utilizes plenty of power metal elements along with the thrash, and again, it's a fantastic mix. The track Beirut's Sword is a perfect example, and absolutely packed with killer riff after killer riff, going back and forth between styles. Although this time, they've also added in some heavy Metallica vibes. And somehow, Greg's ferocious vocals maintain their power and control throughout the album, going from raspy growls to a crazy high falsetto.
Lucky Lord, God of the night. Lucky Lord, Lucky Lord, Lucky Lord, Demon of the night. Lucky Lord, Lucky Lord. Blood, 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 blood.
I simply have nothing negative to say about this album. If I were going to play every awesome part, I'd basically be playing the entire thing, because every track on here freaking rips. The additional track for the English version, Tempest Sun, is also great, as well as the instrumental, The Trojan Horse. It's very thrashy for the majority of the song, but then goes into one of my favorite parts of the album. Following Last Warrior, Bogusz would either quit or be let go, so Andre would move over to bass, and Turbo would bring on new second guitarist Robert Friedrich for their next album, Epidemic. An English version would come out the following year, and this time they only added the English lyrics, rather than re-record the whole album. Epidemic is much more technical thrash metal than their previous albums, and removes most of the power metal elements. Although, interestingly, Greg has opted for a cleaner vocal style here, and he still sounds great, but the songwriting doesn't seem to focus as much on melodies for this one.
Before you manage to turn around, life will pass like a dream. The past will never be found.
In fact, Loop of Time may have the most melodic chorus on Epidemic, which is probably why it stuck out to me a bit.
Day by day, you're nearing the end. Day by day, you're burning away. Day by day, you're nearing the end. Day by day, you're burning away.
Friedrich seems to bring more of an Anthrax or Suicidal Tendencies feel to the music, which isn't my thing personally, but it may work better for fans of that 90s funk metal thrash style.
The first blow to destroy your precious life, the accomplished move. It's you.
For me, it's just not as compelling as their previous two albums. And considering how well those were received, it's interesting that Turbo would make what feels like another significant change in their style. But still, there are moments on Epidemic I like, and it does contain some nice solos. Following the 1990 Metal Mania show, both Greg and Andre would decide to leave Turbo. So Wojciech would bring on bassist Tomasz Olszewski, and Robert would move over to vocals. This lineup would record Turbo's 7th album, Dead End, that same year, this time in English only.
Everyone will have this last hour, last minute, last second, and your last day. Last day. Everyone will have his time for last heartbeat, till last breath.
I have to say, I like this one quite a bit more than Epidemic. It has a much more straightforward approach with the thrash, and drops the more overt Anthrax influences.
We are subject to them. Everyone.
Robert is a very different singer from Greg, with Robert's vocals bordering on death metal, but it's a good fit for the groovy, aggressive thrash.
As we're shouting, Christ don't keep dying. Light will light every eye. Pressure will crush you like an oil. Its race will turn into nuclear waste. Annihilate. Annihilate.
And there are some absolutely blistering solos on here as well. As far as 90s thrash albums go, Dead End is super solid, alternating between speed and groove riffs. And while it doesn't really deviate from that, it still offers some interesting ideas that give each track its own personality. The technical side is still there, but used more sparingly, and overall, it works better for me here. Unfortunately, the album received little attention, and Wojciech would disband Turbo in 1991. However, he'd revive it briefly in 1992 to record the album One Way, which only released on cassette tape.
Only one captured, only one wait, only 1 week. Thousands are dying, it's without mercy. Sadness cannot, soldiers for sale, taking all the nations. God is the only legislator, and if you wanna, you can find the word.
Along with Wojciech on guitar, this one features Radosław Kazmarek on bass and vocals, and Marcin Białowiak on guitar and vocals. Both Thomas Gess and Sławomir Brilka are credited as drummers, but Thomas is the one who actually appears in the album photo. But oddly, in the liner notes, he's credited as Zix, and bass is credited to Jacek, with Radoswav's name nowhere to be found. So maybe it's an alias? Regardless, One Way is essentially a continuation of Dead End, with an in-your-face thrash approach with death metal mixed in.
What I see, everybody can save you. Now is the bed. I can make again. Contaminated world. My schizophrenic dream is over. Gates of my dreams shut behind me. Too much reality, too many lies.
Radoswav seems to be the main singer, with Marcin providing prominent backing vocals, and overall it sounds pretty similar to what Robert was doing on Dead End.
Somebody cry, no more pain. Divided way, stubborn with skills. I want in my growth, whatever I alive. This is one way, the only way. This is one way. This is one way, the only way. This is one way.
And while I'd put Dead End above One Way, there's still some awesome guitar work on this one that adds an additional layer to the mix. But Turbo would break up again after this, and everyone would go off to different projects. However, they'd start playing together again in late 1995, with Greg back on vocals and Bogusz back on bass. Wojciech would be joined on guitar by One Way contributor Marcin, and Simon Zomkowski would join on drums. It wouldn't be until 2001, though, that Turbo would release a new album, now with Greg, Bogusz, and Wojciech, plus Mariusz Bobkowski now on drums. Now on Metal Mind Productions, this would be Turbo's 8th album, Avatar, this time released only in Polish.
Gdy padają groźne słowa, kiedy widać kim jest wróg. Wielka armia już gotowa, by zniszczyć własny lud. Stają dumnie na granicy, groźne miny zdobią twarz. Ogrom dzieła się dokona, bo zwycięstwo żyje nas.
But rather than go back to a heavy thrash style, Turbo would instead go for a more straightforward hard rock sound on this one.
Co się stało, co się na nas? Co się stało, czy mamy jeszcze czas?
It's got sort of a generic early 2000s new metal style, and even after giving it a few listens, not a lot really stood out for me.
Jaki sens ma życie w stanie upojenia, zabijanie? Ciągłe wojny niszczą wszystko. Oto ludzka rzeczywistość.
Everyone sounds good enough, the rhythm section has plenty to do, and the solos are decent, but it's missing the memorable melodic moments from previous albums, and ultimately, the songwriting just isn't there on this one.
Chroni nas, nie oddawaj bestiom imię prawa. Chroni mnie, moje serce będzie mogło potem więcej.
Mariusz would leave after recording the album in 2001, to be replaced by drummer Tomek Szysaniak, and Turbo would also bring on a second guitarist again at this point in 23-year-old Dominik Jokiel. In 2004, this lineup would release Identity. can say that Identity is at least a big step in the right direction, with more of a heavy, melodic hard rock sound.
Bywam snem, nie umieram, panie się.
And it seems like Dominic is a good addition too, because the more modern guitar elements feel a lot more natural and effective here as well. Still, a lot of it kinda drags in places, and I'd say most of this album falls under the decent to pretty good range. It's nothing groundbreaking, but easy enough to listen to, with some tracks that are better than others. Although the best of the bunch may be the instrumental, Aeneid. It's also one of 3 tracks on the album that are over 9 minutes long, so it does have its slow bits, but overall, it's still a highlight. Turbo would break up again in 2005, with Greg leaving the band for good, but they'd bring on new vocalist Thomas Strustic in 2009 to release Keeper of the Light.
Jeszcze jeden skurczy światło ujrzysz pierwszy raz. Jeszcze tylko krzyk i twój odliczać zaczną czas. Dziwne palce tego świata głaszczą ciało twe. Nagie i bezbronne, przerażone pierwszym dniem.
For the most part, this one works a lot better for me than Turbo's previous 21st century releases, with more of a clear heavy metal focus, although it's still pretty light compared to their 80s stuff.
Droga daleka, dokąd pójdziesz nie wiesz sam. Na progu czekasz swego życia bram. Droga daleka, dokąd pójdziesz nie wiesz sam. Na progu czekasz swego życia bram.
That's not to say it isn't heavy, because it is, and Thomas is a nice fit with strong, clean vocals.
Ludzie, których świat nauczył niewiary w prawdy sens. Strażnik światła w każdym z nas. Gdzieś głęboko ciągle trwa.
And the guitar playing on here overall is pretty engaging, including some sweet solos. There's a nice ballad, lots of proggy touches worked in, and another super solid instrumental. Keeper of the Light is pretty standard stuff, but with some good songwriting, quality musicianship, and more energy than Identity. Turbo's most recent studio album is 2013's Fifth Element, with Mariusz Bobkowski back on drums. While Fifth Element is similar in direction to Keeper of the Light, I'd say this is their best 21st century release. Again, it's pretty straightforward stuff, but well done, with some aggressive riffs and engaging melodies. On the whole, more stuck out musically to me here, and while it isn't something I'd revisit as often as Turbo's older albums, this one is definitely worth checking out. The songs overall are really solid and continue to grow on me, along with some excellent guitar work. Plus, we also get another instrumental, which, as usual, doesn't disappoint. Aside from a live album in 2014 and a greatest hits compilation in 2020, this was the last release from Turbo. They are still active, although now with Przemysław Niezgedzki on guitar, since Dominic sadly passed away in 2022. Hopefully there's a new release soon, seeing as it's been 10 years now without one. But until then, here is your Turbo homework. Grown Up Children, or Adult Children, from 1983 is a classic and a great place to start. But Satan's Cavalry from 1986 and Last Warrior from 1988 are absolutely required listening. Epidemic from 1990 isn't really my style overall, but may appeal more to others. But Dead End, also from 1990, and One Way from 1992 are pretty stellar thrash death metal albums. I'm a big fan of Grzegorz Kupczyk, but I'd personally recommend skipping the reunion albums and going directly to Keeper of the Light from 2009 and Fifth Element from 2013. For extra credit, I'll also include Taste of Silence, or Smack Sizzy as I always think of it in my head. It's a bit misguided, but at the same time has some pretty cool stuff on it. And thanks again to all my Patreon subscribers. You guys rock. I do have some things planned and in the works that will be Patreon only, so check it out if you can. Anyway, that is Turbo. I hope you enjoyed checking out an awesome Polish metal band with at least a couple essential albums. As always, thanks for watching and see you next time.